The homeless genius was hired to organize his life, but the billionaire CEO only wanted to organize their wedding. The socialite sneered, splashing champagne on Esme's, the homeless lady, tattered boots. "We don't allow homeless crazies in this boutique, honey. You can't even afford the air in here, let alone this silk." Esme's fingers twitched as she whispered the dress's failure points. She turned to run, but a massive hand caught her. It was Shaw, the city's most feared billionaire tech CEO. He didn't look at the socialite. He looked at the girl in the faded coat. "This woman is my fiancée," he growled. "Clear the store, now." Before we continue the story, comment below which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. To understand Esme's fall, you have to understand the height from which she was pushed. 5 years ago, the name Esme Vance was whispered in the corridors of power, with both reverence and fear. She wasn't just a programmer, she was a digital architect who saw the world not in objects, but in flows of information. At 24, she had achieved what most veterans in the field spent decades chasing. She lived in a penthouse that looked out over the fog-drenched skyline of Seattle. Her life was a sterile, beautiful sequence of high-end technology and quiet success. She spent 16 hours a day in front of a 6-monitor array, her fingers dancing across a mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic click-clack that sounded like the heartbeat of the modern world. Her creation, Aegis, was a marvel of neural network engineering. It wasn't just a program, it was a predictive engine. It could analyze the movement of grain in the Midwest and predict a shortage in sub-Saharan Africa before it ever happened. It was designed to solve the world's logistics problems, to eliminate waste, and to bring order to the chaos of global trade. But Esme was a purist. She cared about the code, not the coin. This was her fatal error. She had a partner, Marcus Miller. Miller was the kind of man who wore $3,000 watches and spoke in the language of disruption and hypergrowth. He didn't know a line of Python from a grocery list, but he knew how to talk. He was the one who translated Esme's genius into the language of investors. "Trust me, Esme," he had told her one night, over expensive sushi in a restaurant she felt too tired to enjoy. "You handle the math, I'll handle the world. We're going to be legends." She did trust him. She gave him administrative access to the primary servers. She signed documents he placed in front of her, while her mind was still 3 levels deep in a subroutine. She thought they were building a legacy. Miller was building a heist. The night of the betrayal was cold and strangely quiet. Esme had finished the final build of Aegis 2. She had stayed up for 48 hours straight, her eyes bloodshot, her mind buzzing with the electricity of completion. She went home to sleep, thinking she would wake up to a new era of technology. She woke up to a nightmare. When she tried to log into the company VPN from her home office, the screen flashed a single terrifying message: access denied, credentials revoked. She thought it was a bug, a glitch in the security protocol. She grabbed her keys and drove to the headquarters, the building that had her name on the lease. When she stepped out of her car, she saw 2 security guards standing at the glass doors. They were men she recognized, men she had authorized to be hired. "I'm sorry, Ms. Vance," the lead guard said, his voice flat and devoid of the usual respect. "You're no longer authorized to enter this facility." "What are you talking about?" Esme asked, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "I own this facility. I built the software inside it." "Not according to the new board of directors," the guard replied. A moment later, Miller stepped through the doors. He wasn't wearing his usual friendly smile. He looked at her with a cold, predatory detachment. Behind him stood a team of lawyers in charcoal suits, carrying briefcases that looked like weapons. "What did you do, Marcus?" Esme whispered, her voice trembling. "I saved the company, Esme," Miller said, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd of employees to hear. "The board has reviewed your recent behavior, your instability, your erratic obsession with the code. We've determined that you are a liability to the safety of this firm. We have filed for an emergency injunction. Your patents have been reassigned to the corporate entity, and your contract has been terminated for cause." "Cause?" she screamed. "I invented this, every line of it." "The code belongs to the company, Esme," Miller said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "And the company belongs to me. Go home. If you try to fight this, I'll leak the medical records I've spent the last 6 months fabricating. I'll make sure you never work in this town again. You're not a genius anymore, Esme. You're just a girl who talks to herself." He turned and walked back into the building she had built, and the glass doors hissed shut. The next year was a slow-motion car crash. Miller didn't just fire her, he liquidated her life. He used the company's massive legal fund to tie her up in endless litigation. Every bank account she had was frozen under investigative suspicion. Every firm she applied to told her the same thing: "We've heard the rumors. We can't risk hiring someone so unstable." The trauma of the betrayal cracked something deep in her mind. She began to obsessively recite the code she had lost, a way to hold on to her identity. She would walk the streets of Seattle, her lips moving in a frantic, silent rhythm. If loop equals null, return false. If truth equals lie, system crash. She was no longer Esme Vance, the architect. She was the whisperer, the girl in the faded coat that everyone looked away from. She had been erased from the world she had created, and as the months turned into years, she began to wonder if she had ever existed at all. By the second year of her exile, Esme had become a master of the negative space. This was a term she had coined for the parts of the city that people looked at but never saw. She lived in the gaps between the skyscrapers, in the $24-hour laundromats where the hum of the dryers provided a rhythmic white noise that drowned out the frantic code running through her brain. She was no longer a person, she was a set of survival algorithms. Every morning, 8:05 a.m., before the city truly woke up, Esme would wash her face in the cold industrial sink of a gas station on the edge of the tech district. She would look at her reflection in the cracked mirror, the hollowed cheeks, the eyes that looked like they had seen the edge of the universe and didn't like what they found, and she would recite her identity script. "My name is Esme Vance. I am a programmer. I built Aegis. I am not a ghost." She kept her battered laptop hidden in a waterproof bag beneath the spare tire of her rusted sedan. The only asset Miller's lawyers hadn't managed to seize because the title was buried in a defunct shell company. The laptop was her lifeline, her church, and her weapon. At night, sitting in the back seat with a stolen Wi-Fi signal from a nearby coffee shop, she would watch the news. She watched Marcus Miller on the covers of magazines. She watched him give TED Talks about the ethics of predictive AI, using the very words she had whispered to him over dinner years ago. He was a hero. He was a visionary. And every time he smiled for the cameras, Esme felt a fresh wave of digital nausea. The trauma had manifested as a permanent pattern interrupt in her speech. She couldn't handle the unpredictability of human conversation anymore. Humans lied. Humans betrayed. But systems followed rules. So she spoke to the systems. She would walk past a malfunctioning traffic light and whisper, "Switching delay is 50 seconds off." Offset the timer. Reset the cycle. People stepped over her on the sidewalk, thinking she was just another casualty of the city's harsh streets. They didn't realize that the girl they were mocking was the only reason. Their Uber arrived on time, or their Amazon packages found their doorstep. She was the mother of the grid, living on its scraps. Her break came on a Tuesday, when the rain was coming down in sheets of liquid lead. She was in a public library, her boots leaking, staring at a bulletin board. Amidst the flyers for missing cats and guitar lessons was a single sheet of heavy $32 bond paper. It was ivory, elegant, and bore no company logo. Wanted, personal systems organizer. Requirements, high-level logistical aptitude, absolute discretion, ability to manage extreme environmental entropy, location, the Blackwood estate, compensation, $500 USD per day, room and board included. Esme's fingers twitched. $500 a day was more than a month of her current budget, but it was the word entropy that caught her eye. It was a word used by physicists and programmers, not housewives and estate managers. "High entropy environment," she whispered. "System is failing. Needs a debugger. She didn't have a phone, so she walked 6 miles in the rain to the address listed at the bottom. She didn't look like a professional organizer. She looked like a drowned rat in a coat that had seen better decades. But as she stood before the massive iron gates of the Blackwood estate, a fortress of glass and obsidian, overlooking the Pacific, she felt the old, dormant spark of the architect flicker back to life. The gates didn't open with a buzzer. They slid back with a silent, magnetic grace that told Esme everything she needed to know about the man who lived inside. He didn't just have money, he had precision. She walked up the long, winding driveway, the ocean spray stinging her face. The house was a brutalist masterpiece. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end server farm disguised as a palace. When she reached the front door, it didn't open. A voice boomed from a hidden speaker, deep and impatient. The grocery delivery isn't until Thursday. Leave the invoice in the box. I'm not the delivery, Esme said, her voice raspy from disuse. She looked directly into the hidden camera lens. I'm the debugger. You have an entropy problem. I'm here to close the loops. There was a long silence. Then, the heavy oak door clicked open. Esme stepped inside and was immediately hit by a wall of sensory overload. The house was beautiful, but it was a disaster. Thousands of dollars worth of tech equipment lay in tangled heaps on Italian marble floors. A drone was hovering aimlessly in the foyer, bumping repeatedly into a 17th century tapestry. In the kitchen, a high-end espresso machine was hissing steam like a wounded dragon. And in the center of the chaos stood Shaw. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 32, with dark, unkempt hair and eyes that burned with a frantic, restless intelligence. He was wearing a t-shirt with a coffee stain and a pair of trousers that cost more than Esme's car. He looked like a man who was winning at life but losing his mind. "You're the organizer?" Shaw asked, not looking at her, but at the tablet in his hand. The last 3 pros quit within an hour. One said the house was haunted. One tried to organize my socks by color, and I fired him for wasting my time. What makes you different, ghost girl? Esme didn't answer. She walked over to the kitchen counter, ignored the steam, and looked at the espresso machine's digital interface. The PID controller is miscalibrated, she whispered, her fingers flying over the touchscreen. It's trying to boil at sea-level pressure, but we're $200 feet above. The atmospheric sensor is blocked by scale. If pressure exceeds $15 bars, emergency vent. She tapped a final command. The hissing stopped instantly. The machine let out a satisfied purr and began to brew a perfect dark shot of espresso. Shaw finally looked up from his tablet. He looked at the machine, then at the girl in the faded coat. "You didn't even read the manual," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Manuals are for people who can't read the architecture," Esme replied. She turned and looked at the hovering drone. The ultrasonic sensors are bouncing off the tapestry's gold thread. It thinks the wall is a mirror. Turn off the avoidance subroutine and switch to LiDAR only. Shaw watched in stunned silence as the drone suddenly leveled out and glided perfectly to its charging pad. He had spent 3 days trying to fix that drone. She had done it in 10 seconds. "Who are you?" Shaw asked, stepping closer. He smelled like expensive sandalwood and old circuit boards. "I'm Esme," she said. She didn't give her last name. She couldn't. "I organize systems. Your house is a system. Your schedule is a system. Right now your system is crashing." Shaw looked around his sprawling, chaotic palace. He was the CEO of Shaw Global, a man who moved mountains of data every day. But he couldn't remember to eat or where he had left his legal briefs. He was a king in a kingdom of clutter. "My board of directors thinks I'm losing it," Shaw said, his voice surprisingly raw. "They think I've become a liability. They're looking for an excuse to oust me. I need this house to be a fortress. I need my life to be a machine." "A machine needs a heart," Esme whispered, her lips moving in a familiar pattern. "And a debugger." "I'll take the job, but I have 2 conditions." "Name them," Shaw said. "1, I work at night. I don't want to be seen by your staff. 2, I need a room with a door that locks from the inside, and a dedicated high-speed uplink. No questions asked." Shaw studied her. He saw the trauma in the way she stood, the defensive posture, the way she flinched at loud noises. But he also saw the raw, terrifying intellect in her eyes. He recognized it because he saw it in the mirror every morning. "Done," Shaw said. "There's a suite on the 3rd floor. The previous owner built it as a panic room. It has its own fiber optic line. Welcome to the glass house, Esme. Try not to break anything." "I don't break things, Mr. Shaw," Esme said as she turned to leave the room. "I fix them. It's the people who break. The systems just follow the path of least resistance." As she climbed the stairs to her new sanctuary, she heard Shaw call out after her. "And, Esme?" She paused. "Stop whispering. I can't hear what you're saying." Esme didn't turn around. She just smiled to herself. "That's the point, Shaw. If you could hear it, the code would be compromised." For the first 3 weeks at the glass house, Esme lived like a digital ghost. She kept to her agreement, emerging from her high-security suite only when the moon was high and the household staff had retired to their quarters in the valley. She moved through the vast, silent corridors of the mansion like a program running in the background, unseen but fundamental. She didn't just organize Shaw's life, she re-engineered it. She started with the data. Shaw's personal life was a mess of forgotten promises and logistical overlaps. Esme built a custom interface that synced his biometric data with his calendar. If his cortisol levels spiked, the house's smart system would dim the lights and play low-frequency binaural beats. If he missed a meal, the kitchen's automated pantry would pre-order his favorite protein-heavy dishes. Shaw began to notice the changes almost immediately. He would wake up to find his clothes laid out, not by style, but by the projected weather and the importance of his meetings. His legal briefs were no longer piles of paper. They were digitized, annotated, and summarized into 3 bullet-point memos that sat on his tablet before his first cup of coffee. But more than the efficiency, Shaw was fascinated by the way she worked. He found himself staying up late, sitting in his darkened office, watching the security feeds. He watched Esme in the library. She would stand before a shelf of thousands of books, her fingers trailing over the spines. Her lips would move in that frantic, silent rhythm he had come to recognize as her code speech. 813.5, 4, Morrison, 500. And 12.7, number theory, shift left by 3 units. Symmetry achieved. She wasn't just putting books away, she was balancing the room. She was treating his home like a massive physical database. One night, around 3 a.m., Shaw couldn't sleep. He wandered down to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Esme standing by, the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the crashing surf of the Pacific. She wasn't wearing her faded coat. She was in a simple black sweater Shaw had left in the laundry, and for the first time, she looked human instead of a ghost. "The tide is high," Shaw said softly, trying not to startle her. Esme jumped slightly, her hand going to her throat. She looked at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the moonlight. "The moon is at 98% luminosity. The gravitational pull is $1.02 times the monthly average. The waves are hitting the cliff at $44 beats per minute. It's a stable frequency." Shaw leaned against the marble island. "Do you ever stop? Do you ever just look at the ocean and think it's pretty without calculating the physics of it?" Esme looked back at the water. "Beauty is just a word for a pattern that makes sense. If I don't calculate it, it's just noise. Noise is dangerous. Noise is where the lies hide." Shaw studied her. He had spent his life around the most powerful people in the world, supermodels, CEOs, politicians. But none of them had the raw, unfiltered intensity of the girl standing in his kitchen. "Who did this to you, Esme?" he asked, his voice low. "Who turned your world into noise?" Esme's lips moved rapidly, a frantic, silent burst of code. "Access denied. Encryption level too high. Return to main menu." She looked at him, her expression hardening. "I'm here to organize your life, Shaw, not to discuss mine. Your board meeting is in 6 hours. You have a $12% probability of a hostile takeover attempt by the Sterling Group. I've prepared the counter metrics. They're on your desk." She turned to leave, but Shaw reached out, his hand stopping just short of touching her arm. "I don't care about the board meeting," Shaw said. "I care about the girl who's saving my company from the shadows. You're more than a debugger, Esme. You're a miracle." Esme froze. No one had called her a miracle in a long time. They had called her a thief. They had called her a lunatic. They had called her invisible. "Miracles are just anomalies that haven't been explained yet," she whispered. She hurried back to her room, her heart hammering at a frequency she couldn't calculate. The professional boundary between them continued to erode. Shaw began to leave notes for her, physical pieces of paper, because he knew she appreciated the tactile reality of them. "The coffee was perfect today," or "How did you know I needed the 2018 tax audit?" Esme found herself looking forward to these notes. She would keep them in a small box under her bed, a secret database of human kindness. But the piece of the glass house was about to be shattered. On a Thursday afternoon, Shaw called Esme into his office. He looked pale, his eyes bloodshot. "The audit is getting worse, Esme. The Sterling Group is claiming that our core logistical engine, the heart of Shaw Global, has a security flaw that we can't patch. They're using it as leverage to force me to step down." "Show me," Esme said, her professional instinct taking over. "Before we dive deeper, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell." "Thank you." Back to the story. Shaw pulled up the deep architecture of their primary software. "It's a legacy kernel. My father's team bought it from a startup years ago before I took over. It's a brilliant piece of work, but it's a black box. No one on my team can find the master key to the encryption layer. If we can't open it, we can't prove it's secure." Esme sat at the terminal. She felt a strange, cold dread pooling in her stomach. She had seen this interface before, the way the variables were declared, the specific syntax of the if-then statements. It was hauntingly familiar. "Let me in," she whispered. Shaw stepped aside. "It's encrypted with a 4096-bit RSA key. It'll take a supercomputer 3 months to—" Esme didn't wait for him to finish. Her fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the click-clack sounding like a hail of gunfire. She wasn't typing. She was speaking. She was reciting the code she had lived in for 5 years. Prime factora. Prime factorb. Bridge the logic gate. Bypass the firewall. Enter. The screen flashed red for a microsecond, then turned a deep, serene green. The black box opened. Shaw gasped. "How did you just cracked a military-grade encryption in 10 seconds. Esme didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the screen. She scrolled down past the top-level commands, past the security protocols, deep into the metadata of the core kernel. And there, tucked away in a comment line that only a creator would ever look for, was a string of hidden text. Project, Aegis, author, Esme Vance, version 1.0.4. If you are reading this, you found the ghost. The room seemed to tilt. The oxygen left the air. Esme stared at her own name on Shaw's screen. Her name, her work, her stolen life. "Esme?" Shaw's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "What's wrong? You're shaking." Esme stood up, her chair screeching against the marble floor. She looked at Shaw, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and betrayal. "You," she whispered. "What?" Shaw asked, looking confused. "Esme, talk to me. What did you see?" "You're the one," she screamed, her voice finally cracking. "You're the buyer. Miller didn't just steal my code. He sold it to you. You built this entire empire, this house, this life. You built it on my blood. You bought me like a piece of stolen hardware." Shaw looked at the screen, his eyes widening as he finally saw the name in the code. Esme Vance. "Esme, I had no idea," Shaw said, his voice trembling. "My father's acquisition team. They handled the startup purchases. I was just a kid in the engineering department back then. I never saw the original patents. I thought the company was called Miller Tech. It was Vance Tech," Esme cried, the tears finally breaking through. "Until he erased me, and you helped him. You've been profiting from my genius while I was washing my face in gas station sinks. Did you think it was funny? To hire the homeless girl to organize the house you bought with her money? No, Shaw shouted, reaching for her. I hired you because you're the most brilliant person I've ever met. I didn't know you were that Esme. I thought Esme Vance was... I thought she was a legend who had retired. Retired? Esme laughed, a jagged, broken sound. I was blacklisted. I was destroyed. And you're the one holding the smoking gun. She grabbed her faded olive coat from the back of the chair. Wait, Shaw yelled, running after her as she bolted toward the grand foyer. Esme, stop. If you walk out that door, Miller wins. He's still out there, and he's still using your code to hurt people. If we work together, we can take him down. There is no we. Esme screamed over her shoulder. There is only the thief and the ghost. She slammed the heavy oak door behind her, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the glass house. She ran into the rain, the tide coming in, the waves hitting the cliffs at $44 beats per minute. But for the first time in years, Esme wasn't calculating the physics. She was just feeling the pain. The rain didn't just fall, it dismantled the sky. Esme ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. She was back in the negative space, huddling under the concrete overhang of a pier, the salt spray of the Pacific mixing with the hot tears on her face. She looked at her hands. They were the hands of a billionaire, yet they were stained with the grit of the underside of the world. She had been so close to safety, so close to a system that worked, only to find that the foundation was built on a crime. Logic loop broken, she whispered, her teeth chattering. Variable trust equals 0. Restarting, but she couldn't restart. The image of her name on Shaw's screen, author Esme Vance, was burned into her retinas. Meanwhile, back at the glass house, Shaw was in a state of controlled demolition. He had swept everything off his mahogany desk, the crystal decanters, the tablets, the expensive stationery, in a single violent motion. He wasn't a man given to outbursts, but the realization that his entire legacy was an accidental theft had cracked his composure. He sat in the dark, the only light coming from the green glow of the server rack. He began to dig, not through his own files, but through the deep encrypted archives of his father's old emails. He needed to know if the man who raised him had been a villain or a victim. After 4 hours of digging, he found it, a series of encrypted communications from 5 years ago between his father, his legal team, and a man named Sterling, the current chairman of the board. Sterling to Shaw Sr., the girl is a problem. She won't sell. Miller says she's the only one who can unlock the second phase of the code. We need to neutralize her before the merger. Miller is handling the psychological assessment as discussed. Shaw's blood ran cold. His father hadn't just bought a company, he had been part of a conspiracy to erase a human being. And Sterling, the man who was currently trying to oust Shaw from the CEO position, was the architect of the whole thing. They didn't just buy her code, Shaw whispered to the empty room. They hunted her. Suddenly, his monitors flickered. A red window popped up, bypassing all his security layers. A pixelated face appeared. A face Shaw recognized instantly. Marcus Miller. Hello, Shaw. Miller's voice was distorted, sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a digital well. I see you've been looking into the archives. That's a dangerous place to play, kid, especially now that the girl has vanished again. Where is she, Miller? Shaw growled, his hands tightening into fists. She's exactly where she belongs. In the shadows, Miller laughed. But you have a bigger problem. You see, when I sold Aegis to your father, I didn't give him the whole thing. I kept a back door, and right now, I'm looking at the city's power grid. One command, Shaw, one delete key and the lights go out, forever. You're holding the city hostage? Shaw asked, his mind racing. I'm holding you hostage, Miller countered. I want the Shaw global shares, all of them, and I want the girl. She's the only one who can finalize the ghost protocol I need for the global rollout. Find her, Shaw. Bring her to me by midnight tomorrow, or the city becomes a graveyard. The screen went black. Shaw stood up, his heart pounding. He didn't have a team. He didn't have the police. He couldn't trust anyone on the board. He only had a ghost, and he had to find her before the hunters did. Esme wasn't just hiding, she was analyzing. Even in her trauma, her brain was a processor. She saw the black SUVs with tinted windows cruising slowly past the pier. She saw the men in grey suits, Sterling's private security, scanning the faces of the homeless people under the bridge. "They're not looking for a girl," she whispered, pulling her hood lower. "They're looking for a source code." She knew she couldn't stay on the streets. She needed power. She needed an uplink. She looked at the city skyline, at the glowing towers of the tech district. She saw the Shaw global logo, the massive S shining in blue. It was the heart of the grid. It was her heart. She began to move. She didn't walk. She glided through the alleys, using the shadows and the steam from the vents to hide her silhouette. She was headed for the one place they would never expect her to go, the Shaw Global Server Farm. She reached the perimeter fence, a 10-foot mesh of electrified wire. To anyone else, it was a barrier. To Esme, it was a set of frequencies. She touched her battered laptop to the control box, her lips moving in a frantic rhythm. Resonance frequency 440 Hz. Phase shift the alarm. Create a 60-second bypass window. The light on the box turned from red to green. She slipped through. Inside the facility, the air was cold and hummed with the sound of 1,000,000 processors. It was the only place she felt safe. Here, surrounded by the heat of the servers, she wasn't the homeless girl. She was the creator. She plugged into a diagnostic port and felt the surge of data. It was like a drug. She saw the city's pulse. She saw the power grid, the water systems, the emergency frequencies. And then, she saw the infection. A massive black mass of code was eating its way through the core logic of the city's infrastructure. It was Miller's logic bomb. "He's going to kill the grid," she whispered, her eyes wide. "He doesn't realize the feedback loop will cause the transformers to explode. He's going to burn the city down." Suddenly, a hand clamped over her mouth. Esme froze, her heart stopping. She prepared to bite, to fight, to scream, but then a familiar scent reached her. Sandalwood and old circuit boards. "It's me," Shaw whispered in her ear. "Don't scream. Sterling's men are in the lobby. They followed my car." He let go of her, and Esme spun around, her eyes blazing with fury. "You followed me here? To finish the job?" "I'm here to save the city, Esme," Shaw said, his voice raw with desperation. "And I'm here to give you your life back. I found the emails. My father and Sterling. They set you up. Miller was their hitman. I didn't know, Esme. I swear." Esme looked at him, her chest heaving. "He's going to trigger a blackout, Shaw. He's going to destroy everything I built." "I know," Shaw said, stepping closer. "But he can't stop you. You're the only one who can speak to this machine. I've brought the master keys from my father's private vault. It's the original documentation, the proof of what they did." He handed her a small silver drive. "This is your weapon, Esme. Use it, not for me, not for the company. Use it for the city." Esme looked at the drive, then at the massive wall of server racks. The trauma was still there, the voices were still whispering, but the logic was clearer than ever. "I don't need the master keys, Shaw," she said, her voice dropping to a low, powerful tone. "I wrote the lock. I don't need a key to get into my own house." She turned back to the terminal, her fingers dancing across the keys with a speed Shaw had never seen before. She wasn't just typing anymore, she was conducting an orchestra of data. "Chapter 1 is over, Shaw," she whispered, a fierce smile touching her lips. "Now, let's show them what happens when the ghost takes control of the machine." Outside, the first of Sterling's men burst through the server room doors, their guns drawn. But they were too late. The room began to glow with a brilliant, pulsing blue light. The battle for the grid had begun. The server room was a cathedral of humming metal, glowing neon blue as the security guards breached the perimeter. Shaw stood by the door, using a heavy equipment rack to barricade the entrance. "Esme, you have 2 minutes before they're through," Shaw shouted over the roar of the cooling fans. Esme didn't look up. Her world had narrowed to the scrolling green text on the monitor. She saw Miller's logic bomb, a parasitic code designed to overload the city's power transformers. It was a digital wildfire, and it was seconds away from the point of no return. "He thinks he's using my algorithm," Esme whispered, her lips moving in a frantic, perfect rhythm. "But he's using the version with the flaw. The one I abandoned because it couldn't handle the heat. System override. Initiate the Esmeralda subroutine. Purge the infection." Her fingers struck the keys like a percussionist. On the screen, the black mass of Miller's code began to dissolve, eaten away by a surge of white light. In his high-rise office downtown, Marcus Miller watched in horror as his screens went dark. His leverage was gone. His weapon had been turned into ash by the very ghost he thought he had buried. "Encryption shattered," Esme said, her voice echoing in the server room. "The grid is stable, and I just sent every piece of evidence, the theft, the blacklisting, the blackmail, to the FBI and every news outlet in the country." The door to the server room finally buckled. Sterling stepped through, flanked by guards, his face twisted in a mask of corporate greed. But before he could speak, every phone in the room chimed simultaneously. It was a news alert. The ghost of Silicon Valley had returned, and she was naming names. Sterling looked at the screen, then at Esme. He knew it was over. The system had finally balanced its own books. 6 weeks later, the glass house was no longer a fortress of chaos. It was a home. The legal battle had been swift and brutal. Marcus Miller and Sterling were awaiting trial for industrial espionage and public endangerment. The Shaw Global Board had been dissolved, and in a move that shocked the tech world, Shaw had transferred the majority of his shares to the woman who had actually built the foundation of the company. Esme stood on the balcony, looking out at the Pacific. She was wearing a simple, elegant white dress, not the one from the boutique, but one she had chosen for herself. Her hair was clean, her eyes were clear, and the whispering had slowed to a gentle hum. Shaw walked out to join her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "The board of the new corporation is asking for the first quarterly report, Madam CEO." Esme took a sip of the coffee, smiling. "Tell them the system is running at 100% efficiency. There are no bugs in the architecture." Shaw leaned against the railing, looking at her with a depth of respect that went beyond business. "I spent my life trying to organize the world because I was afraid of the mess. You showed me that the mess is where the truth lives." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring made of polished platinum, etched with a single line. Of binary code, 01,001,100, love. "Esme," he said, his voice dropping to a low emotional frequency. "The professional optimization is finished, but I'd like to keep debugging the rest of our lives together, not as a billionaire and a ghost, but as 2 people who finally found the right code." Esme looked at the ring, then at the man who had stood between her and the darkness. She didn't have to calculate the probability of happiness. For the first time in her life, she just felt it. "The logic is sound, Shaw," she whispered, leaning in to kiss him. Access granted. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a glowing testament to a woman who had been erased and then rewritten. The homeless programmer was gone, replaced by a queen who knew that the most. Important system in the world isn't built of code, it's built of truth. What do you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments and rate the story from 0 to 10. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories, and don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen and playlist.